State your name, Lieutenant." The Admiral ordered his voice sharp. The room still. No one expected what happened next. When she spoke, he recognized her voice instantly, and in that one moment, the entire base went silent. Because hidden behind that uniform wasn't just a soldier. It was a legend he thought was long gone. Her identity had been buried for years, until now. What she revealed next changed military history. Please support us by subscribing to the channel and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to see how far this story reaches. At the height of a high-level naval training simulation off the coast of Virginia, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The brass had gathered to observe an operation designed to test the limits of both personnel and systems. Among dozens of junior officers stood Lieutenant Tessa Monroe, a quiet, observant woman with an air of composure that made her nearly invisible in a room full of egos. She had been stationed at Naval Base Orion only 2 weeks earlier, arriving with clean records and commendable but unremarkable credentials. What no one knew was that Tessa wasn't just another cog in the machine. Every part of her presence had been carefully engineered, from the subtle stoop in her posture, the modest tone in her voice, to the small scars painted on her hands to imply years of grunt field work. Even her speech patterns were recalibrated. Nothing about her screamed extraordinary, which was exactly the point. This wasn't just another war game. The stakes were higher than anyone realized, and Tessa Monroe had a silent mission no one knew existed, hidden under rank and routine. She was about to tip the scales of the entire operation without anyone realizing who she truly was. The exercise was entering its most demanding phase, a simulated maritime crisis involving multiple hostile vessels, cyber interference, and a jammed communication grid. Every officer on deck was feeling the heat. Orders flew like bullets. Tactical displays shifted every second. The intensity was by design meant to simulate the kind of chaos only seen in real conflict, and Lieutenant Tessa Monroe remained unshaken. At first, her involvement seemed minimal, relegated to observation and logistical oversight in her unit. But gradually, Tessa began suggesting small adjustments, a radar scan angle here, a change in patrol timing there. Each recommendation was subtle, modestly delivered, and framed as if she were deferring to others. But the results were impossible to ignore. Each time her advice was followed, a problem seemed to resolve itself before it escalated. Her decisions were always 2 steps ahead. She was shaping the outcome without drawing attention to herself, a whisper of strategy disguised as coincidence. On the surface, she was still the quiet lieutenant with nothing to prove. But beneath that, her mind was conducting a symphony of tactics, and someone had started to hear the music. Admiral Gregory Strickland, a 38-year veteran of the Navy, had seen every kind of brilliance from raw instinct to academic genius. But what he was witnessing now didn't fit either mold. He began to notice a pattern. Whenever a squadron performed unusually well, when a blind spot was caught before it became a liability, or when a maneuver saved resources, her name appeared in the margins of the logs, he started watching. From the command deck, he scanned the live feeds, narrowing in on her unit. He noticed how others naturally deferred to her despite her rank. He noted her posture not overconfident, but comfortable. Almost too comfortable. Her eyes darted across screens with mechanical precision, processing multiple data points in seconds. She said little. But when she spoke, officers listened. And then, during a particularly tense moment, she leaned into the ear of her commanding officer and offered a strategy to flank a simulated enemy sub. It was the kind of play you'd only risk if you were certain, not just experienced, but legendary. Strickland's brow furrowed. Something about her cadence, the structure of her thought. The clarity. It tugged at a memory buried deep. 2 hours later, the exercise simulated a full-scale cyber attack on the fleet's logistics system. Communications were compromised. Leadership was instructed to maintain order without full access to their digital tools, a true test of command-level initiative. As the room erupted in barely controlled confusion, Tessa Monroe stood, took a step toward the encrypted console, and calmly suggested a reroute through a redundant protocol buried in a secondary satellite relay. It was a solution so obscure, so buried in military infrastructure, only a handful of specialists would even know it existed. Her commanding officer stared at her. "How the hell do you know that channel still exists?" She hesitated for half a breath, then replied coolly, "I studied old naval redundancy blueprints. Sir, just in case." The reroute worked. The simulation's central command feed re-established. Silence swept the operations room. Admiral Strickland stood frozen, one hand resting on the edge of the command console, his gaze fixed on her. That voice, not the content, the cadence. The rhythm, the pacing, the razor-sharp clarity. He'd heard it before years ago in encrypted audio logs once analyzed during joint war games. The voice belonged to someone presumed lost, someone whose tactical mind had altered the course of real battles before vanishing into myth. Tessa Monroe's voice didn't just sound like it. It was it. He couldn't let it go. The Admiral turned to his aide. "Pull the voice match archives from Operation Night Vale, cross-reference it with her comm input today. Quietly." His aide stared in disbelief. "Sir, you think she's—" "I don't think," Strickland said. "I'm starting to know." Back in the simulation, things continued as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, 2 operations were now running the exercise, and the Admiral's silent pursuit of a ghost. Tessa, of course, knew he was watching. She had calculated this risk this exact moment when anonymity would begin to falter, but it had to happen now, too early, and the mission would fail. Too late, and lives could be at risk. She stayed calm, continued playing the part, but inside, she could feel the air shift, a presence drawing closer. Everything she'd built was beginning to unravel not from failure, but from brilliance too sharp to stay hidden. And the man who once served beside her long ago, in the shadows of unsanctioned operations, had finally begun to remember the truth. It happened faster than anyone expected. An unscripted emergency alert ripped through the simulation. A live-fire drill vessel had malfunctioned, going off course and heading straight toward a restricted civilian shipping lane. The exercise had suddenly bled into real-world danger. This was no longer a game. The command deck was thrown into a state of high-alert protocol. Red lights pulsed. Alarms shrieked through the speakers. Officers scrambled to reassess the real-time data. Naval Base Orion, once a theater for controlled chaos, was now facing an uncontrollable crisis. "Who's closest to the rogue ship?" barked Admiral Strickland, already anticipating the worst. "Alpha Group, Sir, under Lieutenant Ramsey's oversight," came the quick reply from operations. But Ramsey was offline. Communications had dropped with his unit due to satellite interference. Without that connection, there was no way to redirect Alpha Group in time. The entire base was locked in a moment of hesitation. Seconds ticking. Civilian lives potentially at risk. The Admiral's jaw clenched. And then her voice cut through the static. "Alpha Group, this is Lieutenant Tessa Monroe, acting on emergency protocol Zulu 7. Adjust heading 205. Drop speed by 8 knots. Prepare emergency brake maneuver at marker red line 6. I repeat." The words were clean, sharp, commanding. No hesitation. No doubt. They traveled across every open channel in the fleet. All movement froze as officers turned toward the source of the voice. On the central screen, the radar feed showed Alpha Group previously misaligned, suddenly shifting course. She had saved the drill, but that wasn't what silenced the base. It was the voice. There was something unshakably familiar about it, not just to Admiral Strickland, but to every high-ranking officer who had ever reviewed encrypted logs from the now declassified Shadow Unit Echo, a team known only by rumor composed of strategists too smart, too unorthodox, and too valuable to exist on paper. And within Echo Unit, there had been one operative whose voice, once heard, was impossible to forget. "It's her," the Admiral whispered, almost involuntarily. He didn't need confirmation anymore. He didn't need voice-matching software. He knew. Around him, the command deck fell into stunned stillness. Officers glanced at each other, the realization crawling into their faces. What had started as routine was now something else entirely. Strickland pressed the comm override. "Lieutenant Monroe, identify yourself. Immediately." There was no answer, only static. He repeated, firmer. "This is Admiral Gregory Strickland. Confirm your identity. Now." A long pause followed, the kind that makes your heart hammer against your chest. Then, her voice returned, no longer disguised, no longer held back. "With all due respect, sir, you already know who I am." It was like a sonic detonation across the base. Every officer who had ever worked in black operations, every intelligence analyst who had ever studied theoretical warfare tactics, every strategist who had ever aspired to brilliance, they all knew that voice from debriefings, classified audio, and war game footage. Tessa Monroe was not a new recruit. She was Commander Elena Vega, a wartime strategist who had vanished 6 years ago during a covert mission in the South Pacific. Presumed dead after her last recorded operation disrupted an entire weapons network without a single shot fired. Her mind had rewritten battle plans across continents. And now, she had been hiding in plain sight. Silence gripped the command deck. Strickland exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face as the impossible became real. "I want her service record. I want to know how she got into this base. I want every transfer, every file, every piece of forged clearance now." But another voice interrupted from the back of the room. "Sir, there is no forged clearance. Everything checks out. She was transferred under direct authorization from the Joint Defense Command, Level Black. Level Black, above Admiral Strickland, beyond internal Navy protocols." He sat down, stunned. This wasn't just a rogue reappearance. It was sanctioned. Planned! Orchestrated at the highest level. Down in the control room. Tessa stood perfectly still. Her team stared at her, mouths slightly open, trying to process the transformation not in her voice, but in her presence. It was like a curtain had lifted. She wasn't Lieutenant Monroe anymore. She never had been. She turned slowly toward her commanding officer, gave a single nod, and said, "You won't be needing me in simulation anymore." Then she walked out. No fanfare, no salute, just quiet authority. Back in the command center, Strickland leaned forward and spoke to no one in particular. She walked into a war game and turned it into a legend. The air around Naval Base Orion had shifted. What had once been a stage for controlled strategy now felt like the aftermath of a thunderclap. Conversations turned into whispers. Officers walked with hesitation, as if unsure whether to salute or retreat. Every hallway buzzed with the same question. How did we not see it? In the center of it all, Admiral Gregory Strickland stood alone in the briefing room, reviewing years of footage. The woman who had identified herself as Lieutenant Tessa Monroe had just shattered the very fabric of their operational hierarchy. She hadn't merely outperformed her rank, she had orchestrated the exercise from the inside out, without ever needing authority. She'd led by outthinking everyone, not by command. and that terrified people more than they'd admit. Across the base, Tessa, or rather, Commander Elena Vega sat in an isolated strategy suite under private clearance, a place few even knew existed. A low hum filled the room, lights dimmed to reduce external distraction. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't rattled. She was calibrating. Years in the shadows had hardened her. Not cold, but precise. Her disappearance hadn't been a failure, it had been by design. And now, her reemergence wasn't a comeback. It was a final test of the system, of trust, of whether the Navy's most secure institution could still be outmaneuvered by one woman with a plan. And she had succeeded. But this time, she wasn't here to disappear again. Admiral Strickland entered the room without a word. The door clicked softly shut behind him. No guards, no aides, just the two of them, old war dogs with a history sealed in ink and fire. "You knew I'd recognize your voice," he said calmly. Tessa didn't look up. "I planned for it to happen on day 3. You beat me by 6 hours. Strickland gave a dry chuckle, though his eyes were sharp. So this entire exercise, the tactics, the voice slip, even your silence, it was all part of a greater op. She finally met his gaze. It wasn't about fooling the Navy, Admiral. It was about proving that the Navy could still be fooled. His jaw tightened. That's not a comforting mission objective. "It's not meant to be," she replied. "You don't repair a breach by pretending it doesn't exist. You patch it by letting something or someone exploit it first. I was that someone." Strickland exhaled, running a hand over his weathered jaw. "I reviewed your records, or what's left of them, half redacted, half ghost stories. You were considered dead." "I needed to be," she said simply. "Dead people aren't questioned. Dead people don't get followed." "But why return now?" he asked. "Genuinely?" She paused, then leaned back. "Because you're facing something you don't even see coming. And I needed to know if the system would collapse under subtle pressure before it's hit with real force." Strickland narrowed his eyes. "Are you saying an actual breach is coming?" Tessa didn't answer directly. Instead, she activated a console behind her, revealing a projection encrypted threads of cyber attacks, cloaked asset movements, irregular defense patterns, all connected by a name she didn't speak out loud because even whispering it carried weight. Strickland's eyes widened. "My God, this isn't a theory." She nodded. "This is already in motion, and I needed to know if your people could detect something invisible." He stepped back, overwhelmed. The shift in perspective was complete. She wasn't a rogue strategist playing a personal game. She was the only firewall between national collapse and enemy infiltration. And she had just proven the Navy wasn't ready. Back in the operations wing, officers reviewed footage of the simulation now under the lens of hindsight. Every maneuver, every adjustment Tessa made, now looked like an open declaration of brilliance. But it wasn't arrogance. It was calculated exposure. She had revealed just enough to warn them and nothing more. People who had dismissed her now stared at the screens in awe. What they once labeled coincidence now read like prophecy. One young lieutenant whispered, "She didn't just outsmart the game, she wrote it." By sunset, the entire base had adopted a new posture, more alert, more humble, less certain of what they knew. For the first time in years, military minds trained to lead were now asking how they think, not just what they think. And Admiral Strickland, he stood outside Tessa's suite, facing the horizon. "She changed the narrative," he muttered. His aide raised a brow. "Sir." She came back not to reclaim her legacy. Strickland said, "She came to force us to earn ours." The following morning, a blacked-out aircraft landed on a private strip behind Naval Base Orion. No insignia, no tail number. Only 3 men stepped out, all in civilian suits. eyes shielded behind dark lenses, movements exact. Their presence didn't need announcement. They were from the Pentagon, and they weren't here for conversation. Commander Elena Vega stood in a secure debriefing chamber, still in her unmarked uniform, still bearing the name Tessa Monroe across her chest, though now everyone in the room knew better. Admiral Strickland sat across from her, arms crossed, jaw clenched. But he wasn't angry. He was conflicted. "You knew they'd come," he said, breaking the silence. "I left them a trail I knew they couldn't ignore," Elena replied. One of the Pentagon officials stepped forward, placing a sealed folder on the table between them. It was marked Tier 0 Authorization, a classification reserved for threats so severe they bypassed standard military hierarchy. "We've confirmed your analysis," the man said flatly. "The infiltration you predicted isn't theoretical. It's active. And if what you're saying is correct, conventional teams won't survive first contact." Elena opened the file without asking. She already knew what was inside satellite footage: intercepted signals, AI-generated deception logs. All the proof of a silent enemy embedding itself within global communication lines and naval infrastructures. Strickland looked at her. "Is this what you've been tracking all these years?" She nodded. "And it's moving faster than anyone realizes. If we don't act within weeks, the next global war won't start with missiles. It'll start with a command from a stolen voice." The Pentagon agents laid out their terms. They didn't want her as an analyst. They wanted her in the field. Not under her real name, not as Vega, but as someone even more hidden to create a new identity, build a black unit, and strike from the shadows. They needed her to build a ghost team. She was the only one who could recruit operatives who didn't officially exist, train them under live-fire unpredictability, and execute missions with no trace. The project name was Protocol Eclipse. And she had full control. Strickland leaned forward, breaking from his usual stoic demeanor. "You disappeared once? Vega, if you say yes to this, you disappear again. For good. You know that, don't you?" Her gaze didn't waver. "I didn't come back to be seen. I came back because I'm the only one who understands how deep this threat runs. I don't need a desk. I need a target." The men nodded. The room went quiet. It wasn't a question of trust anymore. It was a question of willingness to let her go. 3 days later, she walked into an empty hangar under cover of night. Inside were 5 dossiers, each blank on the outside, but inside held profiles of individuals so dangerous, even intelligence agencies refused to recruit them. She scanned the names. A rogue codebreaker in Argentina, an ex-Navy pilot turned smuggler in Alaska, a linguistics genius with known ties to underground communication networks in Estonia, a silent sniper who hadn't been heard from since Syria, and a former CIA ghost officially deceased operating under a stolen identity in Seoul. Elena smirked. "This is a good start." Back at Base Orion, Admiral Strickland stood before the remaining officers in a rare closed-door meeting. What happened here was not an infiltration. It was an intervention. He began, "Commander Vega didn't come to break our system. She came to show us where it was already cracked." He paused. "And because of her, we now have eyes on an enemy we didn't even know existed," one of the younger officers asked. "Will she report back?" Strickland shook his head. "She'll never walk through that gate again. From this point forward, we won't even hear her name." Far away, under a new name, on foreign soil, Elena Vega boarded a private vessel with no flag. The mission had already begun. And this time, there would be no simulation, no safety net, and no one watching. Only shadows. Only targets. Only her. The ocean was black as ink. No stars, no horizon. Just the thrum of the stealth vessel's engine beneath her feet and the hum of encrypted signals bouncing through the tactical deck. Commander Elena Vega stood alone at the prow, staring into the nothingness. She hadn't slept in 72 hours. And she didn't need to. This was the clarity she had always known, the quiet before infiltration. The razor's edge between anticipation and execution. Yet something felt different now. This wasn't just another mission. This was the reckoning. Her team, known only by code names, had assembled across multiple continents in total silence. No paperwork, no flags, no loyalties, but the mission. Each member had been chosen not because they followed orders, but because they were dangerous without them. But it was Elena who transformed them from threats into precision. Training under her command wasn't a process. It was psychological war. She tested their fears, shattered their assumptions, and rebuilt their instincts. She made them see the battlefield before it formed. And in doing so, she faced something she hadn't expected herself. During a simulation in a decommissioned oil rig off the Norwegian coast, one of her operatives, codename Glass, questioned her during a debrief. "You don't hesitate, ever. But that's not human. What are you afraid of?" Elena didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned off the tactical monitor, faced her entire team, and replied, "I'm afraid of becoming what they used me to fight." The room fell silent. For the first time, the myth cracked, and they saw her not as an unshakable legend, but as someone carrying a weight no file could measure. That night, her team stopped following her out of fear or duty. They followed her because they believed her. And that changed everything. Over the next several weeks, Elena led multiple covert strikes that prevented digital sabotage, asset leaks, and destabilization campaigns, none of which ever made the news. But every successful op came with a cost. Each time, she saw herself drifting further from the woman who once believed in black and white morality. Now, every victory tasted like ash. The closer she got to the enemy, the more she saw their methods mirrored in her own. Interrogations that crossed ethical lines. Deceptions that left allies in the dark. Even sacrificing her team's trust in moments where secrecy was more valuable than transparency. She knew the saying to catch a ghost, "You must become one." But no one ever warned her what it meant to stay one. One night, in an abandoned monastery repurposed as a temporary base, Elena stood before a wall of photos not of enemies, but of the lives her operations had affected. Civilians, collateral, unknown variables. She stared at one image for a long time. A young girl standing in the rubble of a digital blackout she'd orchestrated to stop an arms trade. Power had gone out for hours. Hospitals shut down. A child nearly died. And yet, the trade was stopped. The weapons never reached their target. It was a win. But was it worth the scar? Later that night, she recorded a private log, one not stored in any secure system, but on an analog cassette, hidden in the lining of her field jacket. "If I don't return," she said quietly, "let them remember me not as a soldier, but as someone who gave up everything to keep the war from reaching them." She paused, her voice nearly cracking the first emotion she'd allowed to surface in months. "I chose to disappear, but I never stopped feeling the consequences." In her final major operation before disappearing again, Elena faced a former intelligence director turned double agent. He'd been feeding critical infrastructure codes to a foreign AI network designed to manipulate naval systems from within. The confrontation wasn't cinematic. It was cold, calculated. He looked at her and asked, "Do you really think you're better than me?" She raised her sidearm. "No," she said. "I just know when I became you." Then she pulled the trigger. That night, after the data was recovered and her team evacuated, she stayed behind. She stood in the center of a burned-out control hub, watching the sunrise alone for the first time in years. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood still, finally realizing this wasn't about being the Navy's best-kept secret. This was about ensuring the next generation never had to be one. And in that moment, she wasn't a ghost. She was the shield no one saw coming. Months passed. Naval Base Orion had returned to routine on the surface. Drills resumed. New recruits marched across sunlit courtyards. Strategy briefings played out in classrooms. But under the polished order, something had changed permanently. Her name was never spoken publicly, but her impact echoed in every corridor. Officers began studying anomalies in old war simulations, things that didn't make sense at the time, but now clearly bore her fingerprints. Training manuals were rewritten. A new emphasis was placed on asymmetrical strategy, behavioral manipulation, and untraceable warfare. They didn't teach it by name. They simply called it Eclipse Doctrine. Admiral Strickland, now days from retirement, walked alone through the war archives one morning. On a private screen in a classified wing of the building, he played a clip he had watched 100 times before. Tessa Monroe, no. Commander Elena Vega standing before a panel, delivering her first and only recorded public debrief. It was grainy, recovered from an early mission post-analysis years before she disappeared. In the video, she said, "The best operatives don't fight wars. They prevent them by making sure the other side never knows there was one." She looked straight into the lens. "And if I do my job right, no one will ever say my name." Strickland paused the screen. For a long moment, he just sat there, not as a superior officer, not as a strategist, but as a man reckoning with the loss of someone whose genius he had barely understood until it was too late to thank her. He whispered, "You were never invisible. Vega. Just irreplaceable." Elsewhere, far from command centers and simulations, a small encrypted package arrived on the desk of a rising young naval analyst, one who had shown unusual promise in decrypting foreign cyber layers. Inside was no return address, just a drive labeled "Observe, Don't Obey." The analyst hesitated, then plugged it in. A single document opened. No name, no sender, only one line. "They trained you to follow. I came back so you'd learn to lead." In the years that followed, stories surfaced in the shadows, rumors of a woman who dismantled a digital warfare cell in Berlin without firing a shot. A strategist who left ghost codes in enemy systems no one could trace, and a voice heard once in a rescue op off the Somali coast that turned a mission from disaster to success in minutes. No name, no proof, just whispers. And over time, Elena Vega became more than a person. She became a signal, a warning to those who sought to control systems, and a symbol to those who believed strategy could still be human. In an academy classroom 10 years later, a professor displayed a reconstructed simulation of the Orion exercise, the one where Lieutenant Tessa Monroe rewrote the book without ever holding a pen. Cadets watched in disbelief as they realized a single operative had shifted the outcome of the entire scenario without taking official command. One cadet asked, "Was she ever caught?" The professor smiled. "No," he said. "She was never meant to be, because the moment you saw her, she'd already moved on. And somewhere, in a place where signals don't reach and names don't matter, a woman with no uniform and no rank walked past a wall of flickering screens, analyzing threats no one knew existed yet. Her face was older, her eyes sharper. She paused briefly, listening to a conversation through hidden speakers, two world powers preparing for an accidental show of force. She reached for a worn notebook, scribbled a single phrase, "False flag. Predictable." Then, she closed the book, picked up a comm device, and spoke calmly. "Shut it down before it begins. Use Echo Route Delta, and this time, make them think it was their idea." The voice on the other end answered with one word, "Copy." She leaned back, eyes scanning data that stretched across continents. She didn't wear medals. She didn't seek credit. She prevented wars in silence, and that was how legends live forever. The most powerful influence isn't loud, it's calculated, quiet, and deeply intentional. Elena Vega didn't lead by rank, fame, or recognition. She led through clarity, vision, and sacrifice. Her story teaches us that true leadership doesn't need to be seen. It just needs to be effective. Sometimes, doing the right thing means stepping away from the spotlight. Sometimes, the greatest victories happen when no one knows your name, but everyone feels your impact. In a world obsessed with visibility, she reminds us, legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about making sure others get to move forward safely, even if they never know you were the reason. If this story spoke to you, subscribe and hit the bell. More untold stories are coming. Share it with someone who believes quiet strength matters. Thanks for watching. See you in the next mission.